You where the debate's happening?
No, I'm in London. I came here because good morning, everybody. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm here this morning with three of my esteemed colleagues and columnists: James Gibney, who writes about immigration for us; Kaissar, who writes about the markets; and Allison, Schrager, who writes about the economy. All of them write about a lot of other things too because they're brilliant, but the reason we're sort of zeroing in on those topics this morning is because you may have heard there's a debate tonight. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are facing off in their first big presidential debate, period. And certainly the economy will figure large topically in that debate. Immigration will figure large in it, and a lot of other issues that voters and analysts and wonks like us care about. But those issues matter beyond this election. We have a wonderful story out on Bloomberg Opinion today, looking at the Biden administration's record through a series of 10 metrics, immigration, the markets, and the economy being among them. So we're going to dive into this and hopefully elucidate some of this for all of you. We welcome your questions. It's a live show. So if you have a question, just put it up in the comment stream, and our brilliant producer, Mary Newland, will pluck it out of the ether, and we will try to provide a reasonable and good answer if we can. Allison, let's start off with the economy. You and I have spoken about this election before in a live stream. This is clearly a swing state election, as so many of them have been recently. And in the 6 or 7 swing states that will loom large in 2024, every time a voter is surveyed or canvassed, the economy is at the top of the list among voters' concerns. And when voters talk about the economy, they're talking about pocketbook issues. How do you look at the Biden administration's track record on the economy? And we can probably break that down into various facets, but you take the lead there.
Well, I mean, as we're going to get into, it was a mixed bag. There definitely were, we really had a very vigorous recovery coming out of the pandemic, which it was good in terms of asset prices and other ways. But the big thing, I think the main reason everyone is feeling like giving low marks to the Biden administration is inflation. Even though inflation is certainly moderated since then, you still see a lot of the scars, I think, sort of trauma of what inflation does to households. And I looked at income inequality. And what you see there is you see certainly middle and higher earners still having wage gains. If you look at this picture here, the 50th and 90th percentile, the dark blue line is changes in wages for the 50th and 90th percentile have just still not where they were in 2020. Or I guess actually when I was looking, the 50th percentile is just pretty much where they were in 2020. And I think that speaks to a lot of the dissatisfaction. On the upside, though, lower earners have had large and sustained wage gains, which is one of the reasons why inequality has actually fallen, which is something no other president has managed to do in recent years. But I think what we're seeing, that the middle picture of the middle 50th percentile just got hammered by inflation. And I don't think all the other good things that have happened have been enough to wipe that taste out of their mouth.
I just want to mix it up with you a little bit on that. Since you said it, inflation is the reason we would give the Biden administration low marks on the economic performance that has surrounded it. Is looking at it solely through inflation fair when you have strong GDP growth, strong job growth, you've had wage growth? I'm not trying to dismiss the impact of inflation on people's lives. And, I think when we say inflation, we're really talking about affordability writ large around housing and the cost of college and people being able to save for their retirements. But is it, I don't think everyone is giving the Biden administration low marks on its economic performance. I guess I would want to come back to that and just hear you kind of mix it up with me and clarify your thinking on that.
Well, I would never say fair, because honestly, I think, often economic conditions are not the fault of the president anyway. And I personally don't Anyway, I think the American Rescue Plan contributed to inflation. I don't blame Biden entirely for inflation. But, all these other metrics, I said like GDP, stock growth, for a lot of middle earners don't really mean anything if their real income hasn't increased. I don't think that's necessarily fair, but that's just where people are. And I think there's also, I said, the trauma of going to the grocery store and not being able to sort of afford things, I think is looming still in people's minds. So, and it's just, as I said, hard to get away from that. And it's going to take a while for people to feel, as I said, inflation is moderating. In a lot of ways, you could call this a successful economy. We've had growing GDP. We've had extraordinary job growth. But as I said, the not having the big real income gains, I think, as I said, really is sort of scarred people. And I think that's going to be hard for people to get over.
Well, I mean, I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, do we have any kind of a sense of how inflation has hit different demographics in terms of their perceptions? I mean, if you're a relative oldster, you're going to have experienced much higher inflation in the past. So you kind of look at the numbers that we've seen and you're like, okay, well, yeah, I remember when. But if you're younger, I mean, this is sort of, terra incognita, terra nova, but I don't know. I haven't seen any numbers on that. Or is there any sense of a breakdown?
Well, the CBO did a report where they didn't look at necessarily by age, but did look at sort of income and, sort of like if you're lower income, food is a bigger part of your budget. So you want to break up different components of inflation. And I think that painted a more positive story. Another thing I just was listening to John Hartley's Capitalism Freedom podcast with Steve Davis. And he pointed out, if you look at my numbers, the lowest, the big income drops in real terms were higher earners. And Steve Davis looked at the data more finely. I said, I just broke up by income category and applied CPU. But he found that the biggest, slowest wage gains went to people who decide to work from home, which tend to be more skilled, higher wage people. And he argues that, in some ways, this was a trade-off they chose to make. They chose to retain that flexibility of working from home. So they had slower wage gains. And, it's hard to say that necessarily they are worse off then. Anyway, they got hammered by inflation more because they also arguably have a higher quality of life. So I think perhaps those higher earners aren't quite as upset as the middle earners who sort of got just trapped with sort of more stagnation.
Although, if we're talking about earnings and inflation that, I know it's not geologic time, but if you were to look over the last few decades, inflation and really the last two even, but, inflation spiked for a period of time recently. But one of the things bedeviling American workers isn't inflation, it's income inequality and their ability to actually get ahead in the world in just the most common of terms. And again, I guess I think the inflation debate has somewhat clouded record keeping, but we could go on to and sort of score keeping, but I don't want to get us too tied up in that. I do think, though, the Democrats have got to get their arms around being able to distinguish between messages about inflation, messages about affordability, and distinctions about good economic growth. And I think the three of those things get mushed into a pie that sometimes reflects poorly on the Biden administration's real achievements and also ends up in conversations that we probably won't settle today. But, Nir, you mentioned in your column, no president controls the markets, your addition, to our package today. And spell that out a little bit for our audience, because both presidents and many presidents before Trump and Biden, but both of them have used the stock market and stock market returns as a barometer for their economic success, when in fact it's often something else.
Right. And before I get into that, I just wanted to just very quickly just say one thing about inflation, which is, it seems to me, as you intimated, Tim, inflation is doing a lot of work for a couple of very big issues that I feel like we don't talk about enough, which is that, yes, inflation has been very hard on workers, ordinary Americans, et cetera. But what's really highlighting it's really just highlighted a bigger problem, which has been really 50 years in the making. And I feel like we shouldn't use inflation as an excuse to not talk about the inequality that's been sowing for 4 or 5 decades for so many of them that are not making a living wage, et cetera. I also want to point out that I don't think Biden gets enough credit for working with Congress to put together a big and robust stimulus package during the pandemic in order to make sure that this economy does not collapse. And I think there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking in the sense that I think it's easy to look back and say, because we had inflation, it was therefore foreseeable that all that stimulus was going to cause inflation. But I just want to remind people that during the 2008 financial crisis, we had a lot of stimulus to bail out the banking system. And there was a chorus of people who were saying, watch out, inflation is going to come. And of course, inflation never came. And I think it was just as plausible that you were going to have a period of muted inflation after the fiscal stimulus during the pandemic. It just happens that we got snagged by other forces that I'm not sure anyone could see coming, such as, supply lines that took longer to work out, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that is to say that I think if I'm the Biden administration and the only mark against me is that inflation went up, I think I can live with that. I think I can live with having come in and rescue the stalled economy. I just wanted to mention that before we move on to markets. But in terms of markets, the chart that we have on the S&P 500, I think is very revealing. And let me just point a couple things out. I think the what says everything in this chart to me is if you look at the Obama line, which is the light blue line at the very top, and you look at the George W. Bush line, which is the pink line that's sort of muddling below zero, you see very different results for the S&P 500. And one thing everyone should ask themselves is, how do we understand such differences in stock market performance? I mean, is it possible that the administrations were so different in their policies that they had such a dramatic impact? And I would say no. The answer is no. Most of the things that move the stock market, although some policies can inform stock prices, of course, most of the things that move the stock market really have nothing to do with the president or the administration. And these two lines really tell you a story. And here's the story. The story is that when Bush was elected in 2000, you had probably the most expensive stock market in the history of the U.S. And expensive stock markets tend to underperform. And what you're seeing there is an underperforming stock market for basically the entire 8 years of Bush's office. Now, Obama came into office in 2009, right after the financial crisis, and the market had cratered because of the financial crisis. So he inherited one of the cheapest stock markets in history. And of course, that's the other side of the coin. Cheap markets tend to do very well. And what you can see there is the stock market had a great run during Obama's years. Now look at the middle two lines. Those are Trump and Biden. You can see it's basically a coin flip. They practically ended up at the same place if you measure the same amount of time through each of their administrations. And what is the story there? The story there is that Trump got hit by a pandemic and Biden got hit by a tech wreck in 2002. That was probably the worst since the dot-com crash in 2000. And so they both took their lumps and they ended up in roughly the same place. But if you think about all of those things that I just mentioned, the dot-com bubble, the pandemic, the financial crisis, the tech wreck in 2022, excuse me, I might have said 2002, in 2022, well, you can see none of those things have anything to do with the president. And my guess is what's going to determine the outcome of the market over the next 4 years, 8 years, however long you want to measure, are going to be exogenous events that none of us can foresee at the moment.
James, inflation oddly leads us to an interesting immigration discussion. Two of the sort of anchoring notions in some of the policies, I guess I wouldn't call them policy, ideas that Donald Trump has put forth are tariffs. He wants to enact very heavy tariffs, 20% across the board, 50% on China. That will have an inflationary impact if we were ever to enact anything like that. It would also stifle global trade. He's also called for mass deportation of immigrants, which would reduce the labor pool in the United States. That would also be inflationary. I don't think that's the first and most important facet of what a mass deportation should entail in a discussion. That's inflationary, but it would be inflationary. But it's many other things as well. And immigration is a centerpiece issue in politics right now. It'll be in the debate tonight. I think the Democrats have done a poor job of managing the southern border during the Biden years. You don't have to agree with me. But in recent months have sort of stepped up, particularly around asylum laws, to try to deal with the rush at the southern border. And talk to folks about how you see this issue, both in the Trump years and in the Biden years.
So I guess I'd start as a point of departure by noting that immigration is one issue where presidential policy can make an enormous difference. And you see that in the numbers. I would just say that I agree with you that basically the Biden administration performance on immigration has been not good. And that's where policy made a huge difference. And what I mean by that is right when Biden took office, with the best of intentions, he dismantled a lot of the restrictions that the Trump administration had imposed on applying for asylum, applying for legal immigration, more stringent enforcement, stuff like that. And, a lot of those things were frankly un-American. I mean, travel ban on people from Muslim and African countries for one, really the curtailment of due process when you're sending people home or adjudicating their cases, cruel, inhumane treatment like the separation of children from their families and the detention of children. So I'm not saying that some of those changes shouldn't have been made, but basically when Biden came in, he did a lot of signaling and a lot of executive actions during the first 3 months that the administration was not prepared to deal with on the administrative and enforcement side. So, for example, they suspended they suspended a lot of arrests for about a 100-day period. They also came out on the first day with a very, for lack of a better word, liberal immigration bill that signaled that, look, the rules were going to be different. And it's not as if all of a sudden conditions in the countries of the Northern Triangle, which had been primary sending countries, had deteriorated between 2020 and 2021. It's that there was a clear message that, hey, this is the different administration. The rules have changed. You can expect fairer, better treatment. The problem was that we didn't have the personnel in place, or frankly, the policies in place to deal with that change. And basically, it turned into a marketing message for cartels and other groups that were seeking to, smuggle people into the country. So, that's one case where, look, policy can make a big difference. And again, we've seen another case where policy can make a big difference in what happened in June when the Biden administration actually reinstated some of the policies that Trump had pursued, albeit with a fairer, more efficient mindset. And you've seen as a result a huge drop in the number of apprehensions at the border. It was down about 56,000 in July, which is the lowest it was during the Biden administration, and lower in some periods during the Trump administration. So I guess the first thing I'd say is that policy can make a huge difference.
And in this case, it was closing up some of the asylum regulations that made it easier for migrants to come into the country, right?
Well, what the executive order did was basically narrow access to asylum by saying, when the border is overwhelmed, we're not going to allow people who have crossed between ports of entry, people who would be classified as illegal immigrants, to apply for asylum. So they set that number, the number at which the border is overwhelmed, at 2,500 average encounters a day over the space of a week, I think. And that is well below the numbers that the administration is experiencing. So it would take a lot for them. It's not as if they've cut off access to asylum, because they've actually, unlike the Trump administration, put in place processes that allow people to apply for asylum and to apply for appointments. So it's not as if they've cut off asylum entirely. It's just that they've, when the border is, quote, overwhelmed, they've put these restrictions in place.
James, one of our viewers asks if using encounters data and the term encounters alone is misleading because people can cross without encountering any government officials at all.
Yeah, I would say that encounters is misleading, not because of that, because actually, if you look at the rate at which people are apprehended crossing between the borders. It's much improved since the bad old days. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I can tell you that what's really misleading is that those encounters could be the same person having made multiple attempts, right? So that's the real way in which they're misleading. You would think, if there have been, our numbers show that there were 8 million encounters at the border over the last 3 years. And that does not mean 8 million people. It means, it's hard to put an exact figure on it, but many of those encounters are actually people who are, repeat offenders, as it were.
Allison, in the context of the debate tonight, if you could take out your magic wand and compel Donald Trump to ask one question of Kamala Harris, and Kamala Harris to ask one question of Donald Trump, what would those be?
Well, if I were Donald Trump, I'd probably point to the fact that he did manage to be the only president in recent history where every income group did have a wage gain, except, higher earners had bigger wage gains, which is why inequality got worse. But he could actually say, what are you going to do to make sure wages grow across the board? And if I were Harris, I'd say, clearly we've seen that inflation, while might be good for inequality in some ways, does sort of will overshadow whatever other economic accomplishment you have. I would go hard on his plan for tariffs, which will definitely increase inflation, and go hard on, is that actually going to sort of make everyone worse off in that way?
Is tariffs really a plan, or is it just a sort of bazooka blown into the middle of people's conceptions about how economics and policy work?
Well, I guess it's a plan, and that he said he wants to do it. And I guess, he has the power to, put tariffs in even without Congress. So, I guess that makes it a plan. Doesn't mean it's a good one. Of course, when he first said his tariff plan, I think he did say he would put in 10% across the board tariffs, then eliminate the income tax, which I definitely don't think he can do with the income tax, which, is crazy on sorts of levels, except for the fact that I do like the idea that we're at least talking about moving to consumption taxes over income taxes, not this way. But, I don't think the debate's going to go into the nuances of tax policy. I think the question for both of them has to be, if you want to make people's lives better, I think we're seeing inflation will overshadow any other economic achievement. So what are you going to do to bring the cost of living down? And particularly, as we mentioned earlier, housing is remaining sort of out of reach for a lot of people. And that is largely as well to do with a lot of pandemic era policies that I think actually came more from the Fed than the federal government, but is now a problem for the government.
If you were Harris answering a question from Trump about how are you going to engineer real wage growth, what would your answer be, Allison?
Well, what she's going to say or what I would say?
What do you think she should say?
Oh, what I think she should say? I would say that I would work on building human capital. That I'm going to work on improving schools. I'm going to work on making college more affordable and meeting people where the job market is demanding skills, giving people those skills. Because I think what we've seen is building human capital is the best way to have sustained wage growth and productivity, and that will make the economy grow. And as I said, the other affordability is education, and feeling like people can't afford to move to neighborhoods that offer good schools. So I would say I would really work on building human capital and improving education.
Nir, how about you? You get to have the magic wand now. What would you have Trump ask of Harris and vice versa?
I think if I were Trump, I would ask Harris how an unrealized capital gains tax is going to work. Because it seems to me that it's just unworkable, and I think there's just no good answer to that question. I think if I am Harris, and I'm going to piggyback off of Allison, although a slightly different angle, I think I would ask How are tariffs going to work when about 50%, maybe that's a bit high, 40% conservatively of the revenues for S&P 500 companies come from overseas? How are you going to start trade wars with the rest of the world and not have that boomerang on, one of the biggest segments of the economy, and also the stock market, which he loves to point to as an achievement when it goes up, even though it has very little to do with it. So I think that would be problematic. I don't know if there's a good answer to either of those questions.
Well, the recession or the tariffs question, I don't think Trump could answer that, frankly. I don't think there's an answer for him in that question. I don't think it's in his wheelhouse regardless, but I think it'd be hard for him to answer that one. It's interesting though, when you brought up capital gains, if Trump were to ask that of Harris, and you talked about being unworkable, dig into that a little bit. Like what should her answer be to that? Why not, obviously the black and white options are make them higher or make them lower, and talk about the ramifications of doing both. But do you think it's actually, it's more tangled than that, I think?
Well, I think, to me, the best she can do is take a step back and just go to first principles and say, what are we trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of an unrealized capital gains? Talk about that. Presumably, I'm sort of reading minds because I feel like there hasn't been a lot of detail about the purpose. But presumably it's to reduce inequality. Presumably it's to make, we're supposed to have a progressive tax system. Presumably it's to make it more progressive than it is. Because there are corners of, highly, whether you talk about carried interest with private equity, or whether you talk about, let's call it creative estate planning or trust planning that allows people on the higher end of the income and wealth distribution to pay less taxes than they otherwise would under the code by intent, right? It seems to me that that's the purpose. And it also seems to me that there are other ways to get there besides unrealized capital gains taxes, which would cause a lot of problems for a lot of people, because you would have to carve out so many people. Think about homeowners, for example. Think about what's happened to home prices over the last 4 or 5 years. The carve out that you would need in order to not ensnare homeowners in unrealized capital gains taxes would be enormous. And so it seems to me that the people who you're trying to capture is a very small subset of the population, and you can get there in other ways. And I would, because this is my bugaboo, I would go after carried interest. That's where I would put most of my eggs. And I have to admit, I don't really understand. I don't fully understand why that's been so difficult to do. But that seems to me to strike right at the heart of what she's trying to accomplish with that unrealized capital gains tax. It would be very easy to do administratively, and it would have very few knock-on effects to the rest of the population.
So my bad, when you first mentioned unrealized capital gains taxes, I understood it as just capital gains taxes. And you're actually talking about what she's calling colloquially a wealth tax, on unsold assets. And to me, it's a peculiar policy because they're only proposing it, I think, for people who make $100 million or more annually, or have more than $100 million in assets. So it would apply to a very narrow strand of the electorate. But when we think about that, if you were to put that in a real world example for average people, as you mentioned, it's their homes. And if people are living in a home for 20 years, at what point do you say you now owe taxes on something you haven't sold, and the gains are only on paper? And do you do that annually? Do you do it monthly? Do you do it biannually? Is it every 5 years? It just feels like a slightly bonkers and nuts approach to taxation. On the other hand, I think carried interest, as you point out, is very low-hanging fruit. It's essentially an IRS carve-out for how people in certain industries, private equity and others, declare their income.
And I should add, Tim, one of the things I didn't say, and I should say, is I think some of it is the uncertainty around whether it would be just 100 million or more. I think we should say that if it's $100 million or more, that's one way to put a gate around it where you don't have knock-on effects in other places. But is that the way it's going to go down? When you're trying to pass this thing, and the only people it's going to affect are the most powerful people in the country. Is it realistic to think that that you could pass a law that applies only to the most powerful people in the country, I'm very skeptical. And I think it would be more likely that it would find its way into corners that are unintended. But certainly, if it were only there, I think certainly it's right to say that it would be narrowly construed.
James, over to you, and you get the magic wand now. What would you have Trump ask of Harris, and what would you have Harris ask of Trump?
So, if I were Donald Trump, I'd ask Kamala Harris, why should the American people trust you to secure the border if you were for decriminalizing illegal border crossing and turning it into a civil offense? If the Biden administration's record for 3.5 years on stopping people crossing the border is so dismal, and if you waited, why did you wait so long to actually put these measures into place that you know would have curtailed flow sooner? So I think that for me would be the question I'd want to.
Well, Lynn, let's stop there for a second. What do you think her best answer to that question is?
I think her best answer to that question is that in order to achieve real progress on the border, you need legislation. And legislation comes with resources, unlike executive orders. So, the Republicans have been recalcitrant. They rejected a bill that would have actually curtailed border crossings much sooner. They made it very difficult to make any legislative headway by putting forward draconian bills that they knew the Democrats were not going to accept. So, why did Donald, you say that we should do this, but you were the one who argued that there shouldn't be a law, and and I know that you can't curtail illegal immigration without resources, and executive orders don't come with resources. So,
and as you also noted in your column in our Bidenomics package today, Biden metrics, that the Democrats and the Republicans had a bipartisan immigration bill.
Correct.
That they had ready to, be signed, sealed, and delivered, and Trump essentially torpedoed it for political reasons and advised Republicans to vote against it.
Right, and that brings me also to the question. One of the questions that I would have Harris throw at Trump, which is, Donald Trump had, everyone forgets that there was another chance during his administration, 2017, to where the Democrats were like, we'll give you $25 billion for the wall you dearly want to build, if you will just give the dreamers, the children of people who were brought here and or been living undocumented lives, if you give the dreamers a path to citizenship. And during something was called the Cheeseburger Summit or something like that, Schumer, Pelosi, and Trump supposedly had come up with an agreement in which, in return for money for the wall, Trump would have given the passage.
Dreamers.
Right, path citizenship for the dreamers. But then Trump backed away and said, oh, no, we need much more. So, Donald Trump has a history of torpedoing legislation. So he knows, what are you going to do to pass a border bill that both countries, both parties will accept in a country where there is majority support, strong majority support for path citizenship, strong majority support that immigration is good for the country, basically, and very little immigration, public support for a campaign of mass deportation, which is what you want. And the other question I would, if I were Harris, that I'd put to Trump is, Donald, you're a businessman. 5% of the American workforce is undocumented. What are you going to do to replace them? What impact is it going to have on inflation or on businesses if suddenly you're able to whisk away 5% of the workforce? And by the way, it costs $81,000 a year to detain an illegal immigrant. So we've got 11 million of them. You do the math. Even if don't succeed in detaining all of them for a period of months, you're talking about billions of dollars. Where's that money coming
from? You've put in your question that she's going to ask Donald Trump to do the math. So that alone makes me assume he may not be able to answer that one.
Maybe he's bringing a calculator.
Yeah. We are running out of time. In fact, we are at the wall. So I want to thank Allison Schrager, near Kaissar, and James Gibney for joining me on the Bloomberg Opinion Politics live stream. We will be back here next Tuesday. We will also be here tomorrow with a special post-debate edition of the live stream. And we thank all of you for joining us today.